Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is York, the slave of William Clark of Lewis and Clark Journey to the Pacific fame, and boy does York have an interesting spot in that trip. So York was actually born to William Clark's father, or a slave of William Clark's father, and was about the same age as Clark. They grew up together essentially as playmates, but once the older Clark passed away, William inherited York as his own, and York went from more or less playmate to body servant, or manservant as they called him at the time. York would spend his days with William Clark carrying out daily tasks. That is, until William Clark eventually is made part of the famous William and Clark expedition, aka the Corps of Discovery trip to the Pacific Ocean. Now, York ends up joining this expedition, and it's fascinating because he's the only black person to join the expedition. And right off the bat, they make certain regulations where, as opposed to Meriwether Lewis was in charge and William Clark was number 2, but instead of those two bossing everyone around, they decided this was going to be a long, arduous, dangerous journey, and they had a vote to determine how things should operate. And the decision was made that every single member of the group would have one vote. That includes York. He was essentially an equal member of this expedition. Now, he did find some racism along the way, but primarily, these men all saw themselves as in it together. York was given a weapon. He was allowed to go out on his own in scouting missions and hunting missions. He was given more freedoms than slaves were accustomed to. Now, along the way, part of the trip was to negotiate with Native American nations, and York was really key to that because in the Midwest and out west, the Native Americans had never seen a black person before. In fact, it's a little bit racist on their part. They tried to wipe the black off his skin. We know now that's not how it works, but at the time, they had never experienced a person with these type of skin tone before. But it was just this type of scenario that actually helped warm many of the Europeans, the Native Americans who were new to meeting these Europeans, to the Europeans, or I should say now Americans in the early 1800s. Furthermore, we are going to talk about Sacagawea tomorrow, but sticking with York, he is the first black person to see the Pacific coast, the first black American to see the Pacific coast that we know of, when he walks about 19 miles with William Clark from their camp to the ocean. He's with Clark when they see it and say, oh man, we did it. Now, after 2 years, they go back home, and unfortunately, after experiencing all this freedom, York is told to go back into slavery. Now, you might expect he doesn't necessarily take too kindly for this. Additionally, York seems to be the only member of the group that was actually married before the trip. He had a wife who was a slave in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was from part of Kentucky, though he ends up traveling with William Clark later to St. Louis when Clark takes over to do work out there. Now, York wants to be liberated. He wants to at least spend time with his family, and he keeps asking to be hired out to someone who worked in Louisville so he could be close to his wife. Now, hiring out slaves was fairly common, but a slave requesting his hiring out is very uncommon. That being said, we see in the notes of William Clark that Clark is saying York thinks he's done all this special stuff and he deserves to be either liberated or sent where he wants to go. He doesn't. Why would he deserve that? York's attitude was, we all did something special here. I should get at least a little bit of extra treatment. Now, eventually, Clark, when his treatment of Native Americans can be looked at in a certain reasonable light, William Clark's treatment of York just simply can't. He ends up renting him out to very harsh masters, kind of to teach him a lesson, like, hey, look at how good I was treating you. You shouldn't, step out of your place. For a while, York is in Louisville as a wagoner, transporting goods around town and things of that nature. He ends up, unfortunately, his life becomes very difficult to track because we only know what happens through William Clark's letters to his brothers and some other people. And about 1815, York kind of disappears from the record. He's hired out one last time by Clark, who's just kind of sick of him. Clark actually says that Clark, who's then living in St. Louis at that point, says that no one in the city cares for York. He seemed to be really grumpy. He calls him insolent and he's obviously should have been freed, at least in his mind and in our modern minds. About a decade earlier, he should have been freed, and he's just been treated like garbage this whole time, despite being a really important member of this trip who, as I said, experienced freedom that most people had not experienced, most slaves had not experienced up to that point. Now, like I said, unfortunately, he disappears from the record. We don't know what happens to him. It seems that his wife moves to Natchez, Mississippi, so there is a slight chance he goes down there, runs away and goes down there. There is another discussion that once William Clark sends him to Louisville the last time, he disappears from William Clark's records for about 30 years. That is until Washington Irving shows up. Now, in 1832, Washington Irving, by this point, had made a name for himself as an author, and he goes out west to meet with William Clark and ask him about the now famous journey to the Pacific coast. And one of the questions he asks is about York. Hey, what happened to York, man? And William Clark gives a very evasive answer. And essentially says, well, it turns out he was coming back to find me, and he got lost and died along the way. And that was the official story for a very long time. Now, Washington Irving was primarily a fiction writer, and he was very good at hyping things up, so it's hard to tell how much truth there is to that. Additionally, another story comes out. Another adventurer finds a black person living with certain Native American nation out in the West. And the claim is made that there are 4 people that person may possibly could have been, one of which might have been York. Now, the truth of the matter is, we don't really know what happened. There were some letters that came out, were revealed between William Clark and his brother Jonathan in 2002, I believe it was, that talk a little bit more about York, but again, nothing concrete. So, unfortunately, about 10-15 years after his famous trip where he gets certain freedoms and makes certain advancements for black people, so it would seem, York just kind of disappears. Despite being a really fascinating character and an essential member of the core of Discovery, that is a mysterious ending for yet another member of the Corps of Discovery. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the strong conclusion most of my videos have, because we just don't know. If you did enjoy this video, do me a favor and hit like, and if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week, and I'll be back with Sacagawea for you tomorrow.